Thank you for joining us today for a talk in the Department of Architecture's Spring Lecture Series. I'm Terry Knight. I'm a faculty member in the Design and Computation group in the department. Today, we have a very special guest, an alumna of our PhD program in Design and Computation, Professor Felicia Davis. Before I introduce Professor Davis to you, I'd like to begin with an important statement about the land on which MIT sits. The land which many of us who've been away from MIT for quite a while will be returning to physically in the fall. We acknowledge Indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of the land and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land on which MIT sits is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of their territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous people connected to this land on which we gather from time immemorial. Our guest speaker today, Felicia Davis, is an associate professor at the Stuckman Center for Design Computing in the School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture at Pennsylvania State University. She's the director of Soft Lab at PSU. She is principal in her own design firm called Felicia Davis Studio, which has received several finalist awards for architectural designs in open and invited design competitions. Felicia's research focuses on computational textiles. Her work questions how we live, and she reimagines how we might use textiles in our daily lives and in architecture. Computational textiles are textiles that are responsive to cues in the environment using sensors and microcontrollers, or textiles that use the changeable properties of the material itself to communicate information to people. In architecture, responsive textiles that are used in lightweight shelters are transforming how we communicate, how we socialize, and how we use space. Felicia is interested in developing computational methods and design in relation to specific bodies in specific places, engaging specific social, cultural, and political constructions. Felicia's lab at Penn State is dedicated to developing soft computational materials and textiles. The point of the lab is to establish a culture of hands-on making and thinking through computational materials and to link together research, teaching, and practice. Her work in architecture and textiles connects art, science, engineering, and design, and was recently featured by PBS in the Women in Science Profiles series. She is currently completing a book that examines the role of computational textiles and materials in our lives called Soft-Built, Networked Architectural Textiles. Her work is part of the Museum of Modern Art's exhibition Reconstruction, Blackness and Architecture in America. She is a founding member of the Black Reconstruction Collective, a not-for-profit group of Black architects, scholars, and artists supporting design work about the Black diaspora. Felicia received a Bachelor of Science in Engineering from Tufts University and a Master of Architecture from Princeton. She completed a PhD in the Design and Computation group here at MIT. I had the privilege of being her doctoral advisor and being a firsthand witness to the growth and coming together of her ideas on computational textiles, which included beautifully crafted physical textile pieces together with science-based studies and experiments and historical survey. I'm really delighted to have her back with us today to hear more about her work. At the conclusion of Felicia's talk, 2 graduate students in the Design and Computation group will join us to moderate a question and answer session. And now I will turn it over to Felicia. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, Terry. And also everyone, sorry about the technical glitches, but I'm very glad to be here and am speaking to you from the lands that have sustained the Lenape and Susquehannock peoples who we honor at Penn State. Thank you so much, MIT Architecture and the Computation Group for the invitation. It's good to be back and amongst you and look forward to sharing my work with you. So I'm going to share my screen here, and hopefully this will. So I think that the path that one walks as a Black architect or designer has many seams, or places that one improvises and stitches together to make a story, or really understand where one is in the world and how to make sense of things that cannot, under any circumstances, make any sense and never did. There are many gaps and lacunae that are bridged by these seams. And I found the seams, or along these lines, that one can find creativity and ways of making that integrate fragments from the past, but also, in fact, project the future. As many of you know, in my lab at Soft Lab at PSU, and the Stuckman Center for Design Computing, or the SCDC, we work at computational textiles, which are textiles that respond to their environment via programming, embedded sensors, and electronics. In addition, we use the responses from natural fibers, where the response is used by the designer to communicate some type of information to people. So communication for our purposes in the lab means the sending of an intentional message or information through an aesthetic expression. So my work is to relook at the roles of textiles in building, not just as a way to achieve lightweight buildings, but to understand how we can use the fibers of the textile itself to communicate and how that impacts architecture. So this evening, I'd like to show some of the entanglements, so to speak, of working with textiles, computation, and soft materials. I find that the material itself shapes a way of thinking and working that leads to considering architecture and its practices in a different way. I would say that my lab has been working towards an understanding of a soft system, which is thus far to us a system that accounts for and accommodates a technological place that registers a diversity of bodies. This evening, I will share with you 4 projects: a preamble, a quilt, an antenna, and a new project that reveals some of the seams in my work that are areas of investigation. The first project that I'd like to share is really a preamble. It's a design for the African Burial Ground in Lower Manhattan. This is a thesis project that propelled me to look more closely at the relationship between architecture and textiles. It was done long ago, but still resonates in the work that's ongoing today, with critical thinking happening around monuments and memory. Leslie Loco has covered this project in her book, White Paper, Black Marks, and you can find more information about this project there. For those of you who don't know, just to kind of tell the story in a nutshell, the burial ground was unearthed while digging the foundations of a 34-story federal office tower at the corners of Duane and Lower Broadway in Manhattan. While they were digging, they brought up skeletons, bits of coffins, and other artifacts of the old and forgotten slave burial ground outside the Dutch walls that occupied the space that is now known as Wall Street. So construction was halted and a full archaeological dig was called. The project recovered sacred grounds and revealed new information about people who were buried there through archaeological cataloging, carbon dating the bones, etc. However, I was looking for something different, really trying to figure out, what is the true meaning of this burial ground? Were my ancestors buried there? And wanted to make a kind of honorable project that would take care of the kind of sacredness of the site. So a source of inspiration was from an article that I had found and was really taken with on African funerals, in fact, Kalabari funerals, and was called Celebration and Display, and was written back in African Arts back in 1988. So when this article was published at the time, they were writing about funeral practices, which had, to quote, lavishly decorated funeral rooms and beds, which were prominent features. And traditionally, the corpse would lay in state in 3 decorated rooms. Sometimes when the family had the resources, they would display great quantities of cloth. So what you're looking at here, you're seeing cloth that's pinned up on the walls, cloth that's pinned up over the bed, on the bed itself, on the body itself, and included really brightly decorated, amazing patterns. So for me, this was my way of connecting with Africa. I hadn't been to Africa before. And you know, this was a kind of way of connecting and trying to understand where I was from and who I was going to become as an architect. These were elaborately folded cloths on the bed that inspired my interest in origami in my own work. So at the time, as an African American, I was reaching to find my relationship to Africa. There was no ancestor.com to tell you what region your ancestors had come from. So it involved lots of kind of hard work and digging and research. So the drawings that I did for the thesis project were grappling with a way to visually and tactily understand and really primarily translate the materials I had gathered to make them useful for what was of interest to me. And these were archaeological plans and sections showing how the bodies were laid out in the top with their archaeological gridding every 20 feet, showing the kind of soil as it was from the top. And then the sections below showing the kind of nature of the layer where the bodies were found and how Manhattan had built up over time. As a kind of archaeological dig, there was really a kind of giant X put over the site. I called it X marks the spot for the African burial ground at the time when I was doing this project. The slaves were forgotten and visible, but at the same time hyper visible through this kind of rummaging, this kind of scientific going through of things. I didn't want to draw a traditional map, but wanted to undermine the map and all that it implied. Yet I was trained as an architect to draw in plan and in section and wanted to show people where this place was. So I really struggled with this hyper visible drawing method, as well as one that made things invisible to force people to figure out more of the story for themselves. The project, which you can see here in a site model, took the form of a glass layer that was laid across the extent of the burial ground and covered the site where the bodies were excavated. So even those places where buildings were not taken down, at least on the streets and sidewalks, the intention was for this kind of covering to be present. And this covering, shown here in the details, was glass. And the glass had a pattern in it, or in this case, mullions from a curtain wall, from the strong directionality of bodies laid in the ground in African patterning. Colorful cloth that I started with in the article really was translated into black and white in the kind of process of making to also address Christianity, which was present in the ways in which the remains were put into the ground. So all the other projects that I'm going to show you, or that I've worked on, are inspired from research from this beginning project. So really thesis projects, for those of you, all of you are doing thesis, it really is a kind of seed of the beginning. I believe that the takeaway from this project and research was to understand my position in the world. Who am I? What is this place in relationship to me? What are appropriate methods to understand what's going on here? I felt it at the end of this project, it was important to be able to say I and not erase oneself. It's been made clear to me many times when writing, especially for computation, that one should not use the pronoun I. However, the abstraction is highly problematic. I've been thinking about Bell Hooks, who uses the lowercase to spell her name, and restoring I to scientific writing. I think what happens when you deal with positionality in work, that it allows for a different way of asking questions, and it allows one to answer different types of questions. So this revised framing was part of how the commission from MoMA arrived, which was Reconstruction, Blackness and Architecture in America. It was supposed to open in October of 2020, but because of the pandemic, was pushed back into February of 2021, and is now open until the end of May, so the end of this month. There were 3 curators: Sean Anderson, Associate Curator at MoMA, and Mabel O. Wilson, Professor of Architecture and Professor in Africana Studies at Columbia University, and Ariel Dion Krosnick at MoMA as Curatorial Assistant, which really changed how things happened at MoMA. So usually there is one curator for a show, and that curator guides that show with their kind of vision of what they think should happen. One of the things that happened for me with this kind of changed framework of 3 voices is that I trusted the museum more, because this institution hadn't been known for seeking out the work of Black artists. So I was really very happy to be given the luxury by this group of 3 curators to speculate on Blackness in its relationship to architecture. In addition to this change framework, these 3 curators assembled an amazing advisory board of Black artists, architects, curators, urban designers, and writers who attended a second meeting where there was a conversation and critique of the work that was planned for the exhibition. So the work was really discussed and not just kind of made in your studio by yourself. Artists were issued an incredible reading collection and discussed these readings in the first meeting with the group Practicing Refusal Collective, who are in the picture here, Mabel Wilson, Tina Campt in the middle here, and Sadia Hartman at the very end there in the picture. At the first meeting, artists presented a kind of potential trajectory of what they thought they wanted to do, or kind of preamble. And Practicing Refusal Collective talked about refusing to participate in systems of oppression, which made each of us artists question if we should even hold such an exhibition in this institution, which was really about showing its power and shaping a space about art and architecture that was not inclusive or interested in work by people of color. I would say this went on for a while, and in spite of the known challenges, we as a group of artists felt that it was important to go ahead with the exhibition. MoMA had, after all, allowed the curatorial team to formulate what we felt was a well-framed and forward-thinking exhibition. So we all appreciated the luxury and freedom, as well as the call and response that opened with this multi-voice curation. As an act of refusal, we as a group of artists and architects and designers formed the Black Reconstruction Collective at our second meeting in November of 2019. And we came to MIT as a group in December of 2020, I believe. The overarching purpose of our organization is to finish the project of Black emancipation that was started in the Reconstruction era of the United States, but has been eroded by successive structures put in place by white supremacists. We're a not-for-profit organization here to provide intellectual and monetary support for artists, scholars, designers, writers who are creating new knowledge about design for the African diaspora. The point of the BRC was to take the work outside of the museum and to have the work go beyond us as individuals, to get the work to a broader realm and to people who probably were not necessarily engaged in this kind of system of museums. A second point of the BRC was to produce a space where artists, designers, and others could try things or look at things that weren't necessarily looked at because of cautiousness and outright blindness of many of these institutions. So this photograph that I am showing you here is a photo of the bridge into the exhibition. It's kind of gateway that shows what we call our manifesting textile. That's the mission statement for the BRC. It covers the name of Philip Johnson, which was the name of the gallery that we were to show in. And really much like the covering for the African burial ground, prepares new ground for the show by really trying to not make the show about Philip Johnson, not make it about his Nazi kind of connections or his attempt to form a fascist group in the United States. So really what we were trying to do was focus the attention on what had been done by the artists and what the artists were bringing to the space. So we had a meeting on January 6th with all the head curators, including Glenn Laurie, to let them know that we wanted to do this. Originally, we had asked them to take the name down, but they weren't going to do that. And so we took this piece of textile that had our manifesto on it and had said, well, if we don't get to take the name down, we're covering the name. So we were discussing this in a Zoom meeting, much like we are now, while the Capitol was being stormed by white supremacists. Literally, as we're talking to Glenn Laurie and the other curators, people, we were texting each other in the background, hearing that someone had hurt a police officer. So it was unfolding as we were on the line on the Zoom call with the curators. So it was an important moment for us and realizing that what we were doing really, it was far beyond what we had imagined. So these are 11 artists, the 11 artists participating in the exhibition. And it just describes the city that each artist had selected, because part of the kind of invitation had asked us to select a city. So refusal happened in this exhibition in a variety of ways in terms of the ways in which work was presented. In reflection and kind of analysis on what I saw of the exhibit, I saw a refusal to present anything that fixed, corrected, or otherwise tried to repair historic kind of disruptions in the urban fabric that were manifested in the 11 cities that each of the artists selected. Such acts included the regular toolkits of wiping out Black communities in the US, declaring Black neighborhoods as in poor repair, seizing the land with eminent domain, et cetera. So we'll go into this later. Rather, what I saw in the exhibit, and maybe you'll see if you have a chance to visit, was an imagining of what was good about Blackness. What I saw was a potential for making dreams. And what I saw was a refusal to be denied the space to make dreams. So the first project that I'm going to show you really is a project that was commissioned by MoMA. It has two parts to it. There is a part that is a transmission part and a part that is a reception part. The transmission part is a quilt that connects to the Hill District in Pittsburgh, which is a historically Black neighborhood. And this quilt tells the stories about the district, and it's meant to travel outside the museum. The second part, the receptions part, is a fabric antenna that stays inside the museum. So the quilt really, let's see what we have here. I'd like to show you a video of some of the background research that was used to formulate So I chose the Hill District in Pittsburgh, and I chose Pittsburgh as an artist for my city to work on for the MoMA exhibit because I had recently moved to Pennsylvania and really wanted to know more about it. I had done a little bit of work before there with the August Wilson Center and its associated galleries, but really didn't know the kind of history of Black neighborhoods in Pittsburgh. So the Hill District was a way to kind of really start to anchor myself in a place with a kind of real situation. So as you saw in the video, I did a lot of research on it. And what you've just seen is one story out of infinite stories that could be told about the history of the Hill District. This particular video is one of a triptych of videos that tells a story about Pittsburgh. And that particular one that you just saw was to answer a prompt issued by the BRC to ourselves on the question of what is Black reparations. So to look at the quilt was a way really to start making sense of all this research and trying to understand what I was learning. It's not intended, it never was intended to be the architecture of the project, but was really to be a kind of method of questioning. This quilt was made as a computational textile and points to those experiences and skills with sewing, working with soft materials, and brings them into architecture. It's a method and operates as a real material, a metaphor, or a heuristic device for thinking about operations and concepts in making architecture. For us in the studio, the gaps in between the images, the order of the images, the gaps in between the panels allowed us to understand a bit more about what was going on in the photos and what this meant to us. Sewing these down to close our circuits was a kind of a signal of another phase of the quilt. But I'm intrigued with this problem of scrambling the parts in another kind of order to close the circuit. So really intrigued with how one can make multiple stories by kind of moving the pieces around and juxtaposing different parts together. The quilt starts a conversation with people about making and as a repository of history. When touched, the copper in each panel activates a speaker and tells a story of what happened in the panel. We'd like to take this quilt on the road to the Hill District and continue to hear and make new stories with the residents on the Hill. This was meant to be our kind of emotionally and connected networking material. However, this idea was interrupted by COVID, but we do plan to take this on the road next year as part of another project called Unmonuments. The softness in this material is how we've defined the construction of the communication, which is collaborative and incrementally built. The lily pad designed by my advisor, Leah Beakley, now a designer and computer scientist at University of New Mexico, permits the fashioning of do-it-yourself work. This is supported by a network of online tutorials and programs. This network is also part of what we understand to be the material. For many of the works we do, the ability to access and use these inexpensive do-it-yourself components is really the difference between connecting with people and not. So in moving from deciding what piece and where these pieces could go in order to understand the second layer, which was the circuitry, which closed the story on the back of the quilt. An open idea that I've been thinking about is allowing the quilt to remain open in its potential to put the pieces in a different order, but in a way that speaks to quilt making and craft. An example of quilt making craft can be seen in this project that my PhD graduate student, Farzana Aghazian, has developed for her coursework in my course on fiber composites. Farzana calls this the circuit game, and it looks at teaching young children how to close a circuit using pieces that are connected with conductive copper, nylon, and stainless steel coated fabrics. And the idea was to close a circuit to light up an LED by tying groups of these together. And you can find this work published in the Proceeds for Distributed Ambient and Pervasive Computing. There are some combinations of the pieces which are made from felt, carbon, fiber, knitted pieces, scraps of things that we had in the soft lab. And she tried out various connectors and ways to allow the pieces to plug and play. I think this technique could potentially work for the quilt to allow for many different ways of telling stories with the pieces, so that when we do take the quilt on the road in the coming year, we can change what connects to what and what story can emerge. So in this piece that you see here, computational material really changes the idea of a material. It registers in an expansive way with us. A material may be seen as in the above image, where a designer is weaving together a person or body, a body monitor, such as a heart monitor, a mobile phone, a laptop, or a set of responsive yarns and fabrics. And this drawing shows just one example of a textile material system. The quilt would be another dispersed diagram, but adding in for variable people and stories, there's a different material emergent. There may be some other textile material systems that also include parts such as a person who may be looking at what's happening to the heart monitor, or a manufacturer who may be connected with the wearer. To our eyes, materials incorporate bodies and are expansive. And a question that kind of emerges, but we've always been thinking about, if materials change us as we change them, as Tim Ingold and J.J. Gibsons and many others have written about, how are these materials changing our bodies and our way of thinking? So I'd like to just share with you some of the panels. I won't talk about all of them, but briefly some of them. This one's a detail from the quilt showing a scene that speaks to how I set up my lab at Penn State. The lab is a way of foregrounding the making experiences that many of us had as kids and still have working with soft materials. These materials call for another way of fabrication and thinking about architecture that connects both to the scale of the body, because we often start by making things like clothing and then move up to very large scales of architecture. Working this way also returns you to the specifics of your body, not some abstract body that you're building for, but a particular body. And for this reason, there are two research directions in the lab. The first direction is more architectural traditional, where we look at using textiles for sheltering and tents, shade structures, etc. And a second direction is looking at the human body in space and trying to understand the potentials for rethinking what architecture could be by understanding the augmented and sensing body and its environment. And these projects are materials that you wear in your body or use the body as part of its system. So a scene like you are seeing in this particular detail is a very familiar one to me growing up. And I felt that many of the things that I had been thinking about came from this well of knowledge about soft materials. And that interest was seated inside our home at our dining table, much like you see here, typically in the summers with my aunt, my mother and sister, who would work at the dining room table to make our clothing. My Aunt Ruth took fashion courses in the evening when she was back in Chicago, and we always had the most beautifully crafted fashionable clothing as children because of her, and we learned to make these. And although we never wanted for anything we made our own clothes, and that's how we operated as a family. So that clothing and the making of elegance via how you carried yourself and what you wore was a way to transport you to somewhere else. My mother and Aunt Ruth grew up on the south side of Chicago, which now has many sites like this that you see. This is Wiley Avenue in the Hill District in Pittsburgh. An elegant piece of clothing was a way to fight back, to take on other identities, to understand the world in a different way, and most importantly, to dream. This photograph is undergirded by a picture that Teenie Harris, who's a Black photographer, who took pictures of everyday Black life in Black neighborhoods in Pittsburgh, and especially quite a few in the Hill District. This particular detail calls out the highway and tells the story of I-579 that crosses at the bottom of the Hill District. That was part of forming a national highway infrastructure laid across cities in the 1950s and 1960s. So you can see in the picture that all of the bottom edge, the whole kind of area there has been cleared out and is ready to receive something else. So the whole neighborhood, as you saw in the video, was moved. So for Pittsburghers now, the problem is how to make infrastructure to connect across this divide, because across the copper lines, which is the highway at the bottom, is downtown. And that separates Black people from people that are coming in from the outlying suburbs to work downtown. And so what you see now is that 27-acre parking lot in the picture. At the time, the round dome was seen as a welcoming and gathering forum to collect people to the center of Pittsburgh. But as it's, you know, as you now know, didn't work out. Here is a picture of the kind of civic center and then some close-up details. This is actually a site that is now the Freedom Corner site. It has a kind of statue and kind of paving commemorating that place. The second part of the project for MoMA, or the commission for MoMA, is what we call the Black Flower Antenna, and it is located in the museum. And it speaks to those invisible networks formed by electromagnetic waves that we all grapple with in terms of liberation. So again, the project started with drawings. We looked at maps of Pittsburgh, but you know, really struggled and intuitively did not want to put anything here. So the drawing ended up being a drawing of the kind of land drawn as contours without anything on it. And the antenna was the reaction and about not putting something on that site, which is still so hotly contested by local Pittsburghers. The Penguins, the local ice hockey team, made a deal to develop it. And BIG, the architecture firm, has done a proposal for this entire site, connecting it across the highway to downtown. However, after pushback from community leaders, the developers backed out. And these are some other section perspective drawings. I'm not sure what's happening on this site now, but I know that there are many people on the ground who have been working a long time to plan what they want to see happen in their neighborhood. So the last research video that I did was shown here at the MIT lecture for the BRC. And I didn't feel that I wanted my contribution to be putting something on the site that fixed it. So these drawings became more about making and understanding an invisible, ephemeral city. Drawings also functioned as a way of dreaming, and this drawing is called Scene Fabrication 1 to emphasize active construction of the antenna in the space. That dreaming is now. The map of Pittsburgh is below it, encrusted with lace and other textures, so it's nearly gone. And instead, the idea was to show a maker space in the drawing, in the gallery, or a self-making space. I'm going to go through some of these quickly so that maybe there'll be some time left to answer questions. The reception part of this project is a symbolic responsive structure, a receiving antenna, or the flower antenna. It's made up of 34 industrially knitted cones embedded with pink copper yarns that transmit the presence of electromagnetic waves via high-pitched live sounds in the gallery. The black flower serves to make visible and present the workings of an invisible urbanism that floats above the physical city, supported and constructed by electromagnetic waves. These invisible waves are a new global ocean, making it possible for people to connect through the internet. However, traversing this ocean in our everyday practices is as perilous as the Atlantic of the Middle Passage. The black flower is a reminder of this other invisible space that is also being constructed and needs attention for a more life-valuing future. The pink underbelly of the antenna shows embedded copper and poly yarn, which is what permits the collection of the invisible electromagnetic waves to be registered in the gallery. The form of the flower was selected to give us an opportunity to study a gradient of parametrically sized cones. And these were drawn in Kangaroo and Kiwi 3D and simulated to see if we could predict the sizes and shapes of the cones. This is important to help with getting the fiberglass and compression rods the right length and diameters. We also tested a couple different methods of machine learning in a subsequent course and have looked at Mehdi Thompson Ramsgard methods on this using scanning as well as a couple of others. And we are publishing this as part of our research, a simulation process for architectural knitted textiles at IASS. Also, more will be following on the machine learning processes that we have tested with Farzana Kazian, who's working on this topic. Underneath, you can see the pink copper yarn, which helps stabilize and add predictability to the cotton yarn, which we selected. And really, the piece had a lot of technical components to it. I'll go through some of them briefly. There were many steps and iteration in the project, in the making of the cones. And just to go over a few, the upper left drawing shows a drawing for each cone that was based on the algorithms that were given to, we printed out from Grasshopper and Kiwi 3D. And the biggest challenge that we encountered is what I call getting cage, or predicting how much material, how much the material would stretch. This issue really took us a long time and was kind of the scariest thing. We'd made a drawing to the museum that promised a certain size and wanted to make sure it ended up at that relative size, at least relatively close. One tube that we made at the very beginning of our prototyping never finished stretching. You know, it's downstairs and it keeps growing and growing. And that was kind of a depressing and scary moment in the whole process. A second challenge was the knit programming that translated what we had drawn in feet and inches into stitches and yarn types. A third challenge was fitting our cut or bent compression members to the material as it came out of the knitting machine. So where the compression system and knitted material came together occupied a lot of our time in correction and adjustment as we came to understand the material properties. And although a lot of our work is done now to predict behavior, I would say that one of the most pleasurable aspects of working with this knitted material has been improvisation and not knowing what you'll end up with and what will happen. In the lower corner, lower left corner, you can see some of the compression members, at least the ones that are making the kind of ovals at the end of the hoops. The next picture in is showing kind of inserting one of the fiberglass rods. In the last picture, lower right-hand side of the photograph, we had great antenna help from Aaron Lewis, who was a student of Delia Dumitrescu at the Swedish School of Textiles. Aaron has been exploring the potentials of electromagnetism as a phenomenon, an aesthetic phenomenon, using textiles in both weaving and knitting, and really introduced us to the artistic potential of this invisible medium. So I highly recommend looking at Aaron's work through the Swedish School of Textiles. So these are some pictures of this in the gallery at MoMA. And then I have a very short video, maybe a few seconds or so, for you to get an idea of what that sounds like. It's kind of annoying. So what we're trying to do in developing computational methods, tools, and designs for soft architectures is to connect with people emotionally, register their presence, to provoke questions about the order of our society. And we view softness as a powerful quality to think about reconstructing. And the last project I'm going to present to you is in progress. So I will present some parts of it to you now. The project is titled Hair Salon, Translating Black Hair Practices for Architecture Using Computational Methods. And my collaborators are Cheryl Tucker Vasquez at University of Houston, William D. Williams at Rice University, and Marcela de Signora at MIT, who's participating in this year's Venice Biennale. And the Hair Salon project draws upon a rich Black hair culture to imagine liberatory possibilities for the future. It's situated between the natural and the cultural. Black hair care practices occupy potent spaces that can serve as generative source material for new ways of shaping architectures that resonate with Black identity. This project that we're working on will develop Black hair care designs such as braiding, locking, and crocheting to make new architectural structures and surfaces. So this research is situated between the culturally inspired work of artist and the celebrated artist Nonsiké Lelu Mutiti, whose work you see here in the photographs, that explores braiding, knitting, and weaving techniques as a visual form of art, as well as architect Joy Matashi's work, who has described her hair designs as a form of small architecture where Black hair serves as the inspiration, and computational design research of Roberto Roberto Naboni, and Luca Berseglio, who have translated traditional Native American basket weaving techniques into computer code. So the image that you're looking here is taken from her work on what is called ruca, which is a kind of name for braiding, also assigned to methods of weaving and knitting all at once, and it's from the Shona language. So she writes about these analogous processes as closely related to the development of coding languages and computation. So she has been working to bring the idea of Black hair into digital technology. So in architecture, the use of woven elements as architectural material was first described in the Four Elements of Architecture by Gottfried Semper. Although weaving is a global cross-cultural tradition, our research is focusing on the specifics of African American braiding techniques. And we think that it's time to go in a different direction than some Perrian discussion of this material and craft to form a new theory of this work. So our purpose in the research is, one, to expand a conversation about Blackness and technological tools in architecture. Two, to answer how computational tools can translate African-American hair care techniques into descriptive algorithms that can be applied to the creation of new architectural material embedded in cultural practice and meaning. Three, demonstrate novel materials that can be used in the shaping of architectural space. And four, expand the discussion of Blackness as an intellectual and aesthetic force in architecture. Sonia Clark's Haircraft project is now on exhibition at the National Museum of Women in the Arts in Washington, DC, and it's amazing. I highly recommend it. The specific piece on the left side is part of the permanent collection at the MFA in Boston. So those of you in Boston can go see her work as it's now part of the permanent collection. We have, of course, been influenced by Ron Eglash's and his African Fractals book and his work with the Cornrow Curves program. However, I'll add that our contribution will be in a different space. We admire Eglash's work with the National Science Foundation and hope that he continues to do so. And I also straddle that kind of divide between looking at this as kind of an artistic cultural practice and also working with the NSF to expand the kind of cultural diversity of scientists through the NSF. But what we want to do in this project is emphasize the salon in the hair salon and make a space of conversation and discussion. And we'll hope some of you will join us in this as we set up. There will be an invitation and call to join. And so the conversation that we're hoping to cultivate is a conversation about Black culture, its relationship technology, and concepts of translation and meaning making. So we're interested in generative conversations about Black culture and its relationship to architectural design. And we hope that the project will offer time and space to dream new structures for Black life. And the project will be installed as a one-to-one installation at Project Row Houses. And again, I will be keeping people posted about that. Project Row Houses is in Houston. And I'm going to close here on an image of early 3D prints that I made during my time here that will be used, the kind of basis will be used to develop our architectural intervention at Project Row Houses. I think this work that I've presented this evening makes several contributions to methods of work and making, considering Blackness in the United States and the African diaspora. To return to the beginning of the lecture, a critical takeaway is acknowledging and valuing all the different voices involved in design computing. This acknowledgement provides context for computing and can help with understanding the strengths and limitations of what we are contributing to the world. And so I'd like to close and take questions from the floor.
Thank you, Felicia. I'm Lavender Tesmer, and I'm joined by Alina Oikonomaki, and we're both students in the Design and Computation group. We'll be kind of facilitating a short question and answer session. If there's anyone in the audience who would like to ask a question, feel free to post on the Facebook page or on the webcast. And I'll start with the first question. It was really interesting to hear you talk about your work. I think in particular, the kind of qualities of textiles that you're calling sensory and social and political, and I guess the idea that textiles are this kind of technology of communication. I was wondering if you could talk about the way that people react to your work, either when they're literally touching it or experiencing it. Like what are some reactions that you've gotten specifically related to what you can see that the textile is communicating to others?
Yeah, so I've done a lot of work with using textiles that people can touch, looking at touch and trying to understand what different textures mean related through touch and vision at the same time. And so I think there's a kind of there was an attempt to understand explicitly what texture would map to a specific emotion. But as it turns out, that is not so easy to do. It's a really tough way to go about things, in fact. And I think that one of the things that I took away from that research is that it's really hard to channel a very specific and direct message through touch, because it engages your memory, and your people's memory is so varied. Your background and where you come from, it's all embedded from the place where you grew up and people that you were exposed to and all your experiences. And so there are some things that map across many different cultures and people, but I would say I bring some skepticism to that as a scientist. That I think you have to, when you do studies like that, you have to take things with a grain or not a grain of salt, but understanding that it's not a one-to-one mapping that you're going to get out of something like that, and that you're going to have to also read your study into a larger context and extrapolate and translate from the study to the situation that you're thinking of, and also to the people that you're trying to communicate to. So there are a lot of other factors with that. In terms of the quilt, in touching the quilt, like working with the quilt, I think people, in terms of, it really hasn't been out on the road, but asking my colleagues in the lab, it does loosen people up to touch something, and helps them to remember something as they're touching it and looking at the picture. There's a picture that is kind of making and framing the conversation in the quilt. So touching the picture and looking at the cloth and then looking at the copper definitely helps people connect with it. But I would say that's a really different way of communicating, because we're using direct language with like the speaker. right? That's telling a story, and it's making sure that you get the story because we're using language and that it's not touch, which is much more difficult to kind of channel a specific story. So I think that there are different granularities to communication using materials and depending on how you use them.
Thank you. Alina, would you like to follow with a question?
Yes, of course. Felicia, thank you so much for your presentation, and I was fascinated, especially by your project that is currently in exhibition on MoMA, and I'm very much looking forward, if possible, to visit the exhibition in person. One of the things I was really interested in was this a way that you had to tell the story of the displaced community of Black people in the Hill District, and how you were able to kind of try to explore different sensory modalities to kind of tell this story, to communicate this story, especially the fact that you also use sound as part of the way to communicate the story. And I was wondering why did you choose sound as part of telling the story, the history of the neighborhood, and how do actually people react when they actually try to listen and hear the story of the neighborhood. Do you think the sound plays an important role in communicating this story to the audience?
Yeah, I do think that the sound plays a great deal. Right now, it's basically like my voice is the recording, but I don't necessarily think this should be the recording that goes out of our studio to like people in the neighborhood. And I haven't figured out the voice because I think it's really, really important. I do think that in terms of sound, that sound is a way to also avoid the map and to live in the fluid, right? To live in a place that's fluid and to exist in a place that requires attention in that particular kind of moment. So I like sound. I think a lot of artists in the exhibit use sound, and actually that was kind of a problem because there's a lot of overlapping, and so people had to figure out, the curators had to figure out how to make sure everybody's sound could be heard and experienced. But I think sound for me in the piece just gets your sense connected in a way that does not allow for total dominance by the visual. So that's one way that I had been thinking about it.
Yeah. I'm looking at whether there's any questions from our audience. Feel free to post any question on the webcast or on Facebook.
I can follow up with another question. I thought it was kind of really amazing to hear about how much your personal background really affects the work and how you think about architecture and textiles. I'm wondering in your lab at Penn State where you're teaching, how does that influence how you encourage kind of students to develop their own research? I guess the role of kind of really having your personal background start to influence your research kind of in a unique way, and how that comes out in the way that you teach or think about your lab.
Yeah, I think, thank you for these questions, guys. It's always helpful to have other outside points of view, kind of framing what you do. I think in terms of the idea of the personal, I think it's really important for people to understand where they come from and to understand their position and potential relationships to other things, other places. A good example I can think about this, or I can give you about why I think this matters and why I think it's important to put I back into science is something that Tembrit Gebru writes about. Tembrit Gebru was a computer scientist who worked at Google and wrote a paper about kind of shaping data sets and how looking at artificial intelligence. And she was fired from her position because she wanted to publish this paper and Google didn't want her to. I don't know if you guys know about this, but I followed it because I think that what she's asking for, if you read some of her papers, she writes about annotating data sets, like who paid for this, what were the people looking for, what did they want to get out of it, like all these things that she wants to tag these data sets with this kind of metadata so that when you use them, maybe you might understand why, for example, in the case of Joy Buluomi's facial recognition that couldn't recognize your face, then you understand and have a shot at understanding why things aren't working or why they work differently or not meeting expectations, et cetera, and ... right? So I think putting context back into some of these things that we kind of take for granted in computation is really important. So even though it sounds really weird, like maybe if people had said, this data set was trained on, 20-year-old, dudes that were, had light skin or something like that, that might have helped. And it's nothing to be embarrassed about. It's like helpful to science to have the specifics. And so I think when we erase ourselves and we erase when you write in science, they're always telling you to sort of take away the specific. I think that's a way of thinking that permeates everything. And it's a problem that causes problems when you're trying to look at data sets like Tembrit Gebru has been writing about. So I think there are ways around that, but in the meantime, maybe writing I or our or we tried allows people to understand who's doing this rather than these things randomly happening or passively using passive language. So that is one thing that I teach in the lab. Mostly, we've had conversations about this, and we send papers out to be reviewed, and they're like, change the I, change the we, and so yeah. But this is something that I'm teaching in my lab.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for this lecture. I wonder if there is no other question from the audience, if we should wrap up the session. So thank you so much, Felicia, for the presentation and looking forward to your work.
Yeah, thanks so much for the questions, guys. Appreciate it and hope that we cross paths soon.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello again. I think I am now on air. I hope I am now on air. Felicia, thank you very, very much for a wonderful talk. It was great to hear your story. It was really great to hear how you highlight the personal and the cultural in your work. It's very important for design and computation, and we emphasize that more and more now in our group. I also want to say that the beauty and the rigor that you bring to your work in design computation is really quite amazing. The work is rigorous, it's beautiful, it's meaningful. You bring together the best of all worlds of design, art, architecture, computations, and science in just an amazing, amazing way. So thank you very much for sharing your work with us and sharing your story with us. And I too hope to see some of the work in person when we start traveling again. Thank you again. So before we conclude, I would like to share with the audience upcoming talks in the spring lecture series. Next Thursday, May 13th, excuse me, Anna Arabidin Kesson will be talking, and the title of her talk is Vision and Value, Cotton and Materiality of Race. And then on a week after that, Thursday, May 20th, Chris Leong, Dominique Leong, and Sean Connolly will be the speakers, and the title of their session, excuse me, is Hawaii Nonlinear, a conversation with Chris Leong, Dominique Leong, Sean Connolly, and others. And now we will bring this session to a close. Thank you all.